Today we're going to take on block 2 of our wool applique project from Wonderfil. As you can see, my daughter-in-law Beth is with me today. We've both been working on this project and we're both doing the stitching by machine. I brought her in because I had a temporary camera problem while filming, but it turned out to be a good thing. The hummingbird has some new challenges, including one that took both of us to figure out. So today you'll get to see the best of both our work on this block. This is going to be a lot of fun, so let's get started. Here is the hummingbird package in pre-cut pieces. The beak is all thread work, so there's no wool applique for that. Like I did for block 1, I cut a couple of pieces of OESD stabilizer to go under the block. It tears away easily. Now I'm going to pull out the wool threads I need to stitch down the appliques, which we'll need to do as soon as we get things placed. First is EN50 parchment, then EN13 electric lime. Of course we need black for the eye, then EN08 turquoise, and finally EN57 lavender blue. Like last time, I'm going to use the cover picture as a reference and place down the pieces where they need to go by eye. I thought this was actually pretty close to how they should be placed, but later I realized I should have centered it a little further right because the beak is so long. You want to keep that in mind on your own block. I have a plan for fixing it when we get to the point of assembling all the blocks together, but catch it early and you can learn from my mistake. Also, if you want a super accurate method of placing appliques, watch this short video I put together a while back. It uses a small portable projector and the PDF file of a pattern to help you line things up properly. I'm going to iron first. Now I'll add some glue from a glue stick to hold the pieces down and iron again. I'm using Quilter's Select basting glue stick, which I really like. Then iron it again. Just watch the bird's eyeball. It's small enough it doesn't like to stay in place. Now this is ready to take to the sewing machine and do the initial stitch down with the matching wool thread. When you're moving it, you may want to lift the block flat because the glue has a light hold on the wool. Just like the first block, the first step is to applique all the pieces onto the background with the corresponding Ilana colors. We need to start with the pieces in the back first, and that means the belly, which is EN50 parchment. This wool is a 12-weight thread, so you need to be sure to have a 90-14 or a 116 top stitch needle for this project. I am using an open-toed embroidery foot number 20D, and I have the dual feet engaged. I selected the number 1339 blanket stitch, and I have it set to 2.2 width and 2.6 length with a 1.5 top tension. And I lowered the presser foot pressure to 35 from 50, which is the default. Of course, as I always do when stitching down appliques with a blanket stitch, I have the needle moved all the way to the right. Then I just follow the edge of the applique with the inner right edge of the foot. I also have a tailor's stiletto to help with manipulating the wool under the presser foot. Sew nice and slow at first and then speed it up a little. It is a humid day here, which makes the wool try to stretch a little. If your hummingbird's eye keeps falling off like mine does, you may want to just take it off and place it back again when it's time to stitch it down. The next piece needs EN13 electric lime. cut the thread near the spool and pull the leftover through the needle to prevent hurting your machine's thread tension. I threaded the electric lime thread on off camera and we're ready to stitch down the main piece. I'm going to applique the eye before I lose it. Consult the picture to properly place it and add a little new glue to prevent it from coming off. Even though the eye is such a small circle, use the same blanket stitch and settings as with the rest of the applique pieces. Center the circle in your open-toed embroidery foot, then align the back edge of the foot's open toe so that it goes across the center of the circle. Pull up your bobbin thread as usual into the back. Tell the machine you're going to do one sequence of the blanket stitch at a time. Make sure it is centered and then you stitch. Then turn it and make sure it is again halfway across the back of the foot and turn it again. You keep rotating it and recentering every sequence. Continue until you go one sequence over the beginning stitch and cut it. The next on Wonderfil's list is turquoise, but I think we should stitch the lavender blue wing first since it is under the turquoise wing. In fact, I think on Beth's version she took the lavender wing under the green part of the body and stitched it first. Okay, now that we're done with the lavender wing, I'm going to add a little glue along the edge of this last turquoise piece before we continue. And of course, I need to change the thread again. With the applique pieces all stitched down, we're ready to do the embellishment stitching. For the embellishments, I started by looking over the Wonderfil instructions to see what can be done to make our machine stitching that look close to the hand stitches they recommend. I don't think it is necessary to make them look exactly the same, but I want to give it a similar flavor and have fun with this. Let's start with the beak. The instructions say to create an elongated beak with a closed fly stitch and fill the beak with more closed fly stitches. Here's where I realize I centered my pieces a little too far to the left, so I couldn't make a beak as long as I wanted. Still, I decided to start with the basting stitch number 21 on my machine, telling the machine I only want to do one stitch. If you don't have such a stitch, a long straight stitch will also work. I am using the black wool thread EN30, which has a good fill capacity and will kind of hide the stitch holes and meld the whole stitched area together. I did one round, then turned around and do another exactly over top. And then turn it around again and do another. Then I turn it around and this time go to the bottom part of the beak. Then turn it around and continue. Because it is such a long stitch, I'm going to pull the thread and cut it so I can pull it to the back manually. The beginning of this stitch was knotted by the machine before I started, so I don't have to worry about that end of the thread. Later, I went back to fill in with stitch number 31. I'll probably extend the beak a bit more after all the blocks are assembled into a complete quilt top. For now, let's take a look at how Beth stitched the beak on hers.
When it came time for me to stitch down the appliques on my block, I had the benefit of seeing BJ's problems with not having enough space for the beak. Because of that, I centered the pieces on mine a little bit more to the right of the block, so I have more room for the beak. I tried a lot of different beak stitches, and I even had some fun playing with the stitch editing function on my Bernina 880. In the end, though, I settled on using stitch number 401, then extending it to 600% length and 9mm width. It's important that this stitch lets you extend it by percentage rather than just a length, because that means it tries to add all the extra satin stitches needed to keep the result smooth, rather than just making the stitches further apart. I'm also using a 20D foot with the dual feed engaged to keep the wool moving evenly through the path of the stitching. Once you have all that set, though, the actual stitching is pretty straightforward. However, you need to be a little bit careful where you start so it blends with the bird's face. I felt like I missed by a stitch or two, but I had enough thread left that I was able to add a couple stitches by hand. If you line it up a bit better than I did, you shouldn't have to do any hand stitching here. Wonderfil also calls for a slightly larger blanket stitch around the outer edges of the bird for decoration, using some contrasting variegated colors. I don't think BJ thought the second round of blanket stitches would look as good, so she left it out. But I thought I would try it so you can see how both options look. First, I'm going to stitch around the bird's belly. When I appliqued the pieces down, I used a stitch width of 3.0, so for this, I'm increasing it to 4.0. I'm using one of the light gray variegated 12-weight cotton Fruitti threads. Next up is the head, just down to the wing, using another 12-weight variegated Fruitti cotton, similar in color to the thread Wonderfil uses in their hand stitching. Again, I'm using a stitch width of 4.0. Then there's a short little bit between the wing and the tail. And then finally the easy lime green up against the white wool belly. I'm in the habit of burying my threads by hand, but if you're using the automatic thread cutter and knotting the end, that's fine too. After all, we're really focusing on how to do this by machine. If you do want to bury by hand though, you may find it's nice to have an extra pair of tweezers on hand to help manage the threads when you try and tie off the ends. So this is all of the decorative stitches around the wings and the bird's body, and I'm pretty happy with how it came out so far. While we're on outlining, I'll take care of the tail. On BJ's, she couched down an 8-weight pearl cotton around all of the edges with a zigzag stitch. So let me set up and I can show you my version. I'm using foot 39C and have a zigzag with a pretty narrow width of 2.0. The length is the default 1.5 and tension of 2.25. I want to stitch this down as close as I can to the edge of the tail because I'd rather not see the blue fabric show through. Now, the same thing on the other side. So you can see on the pattern that they do this on just two sides, so I did the same. One other thing I did different from BJ's version was to use a darker 8-weight, number 1008, that had a lot of contrast with the cotton that I'm using to couch down. Now I just need to bury the threads. Now the pattern calls for some relatively straight lines of back stitching that will make the tail look more like feathers. BJ followed that pretty closely on hers, and I will as well. I'm going to use the same variegated thread that I did for the decorative blanket stitch around this part of the bird. So like on the picture on Wonderfil's pattern, I'm stitching some longer lines that are pretty evenly spaced. I'm using a number 6 triple stitch and the 20D foot. Now I'm going back and stitching a couple of shorter lines to fill in. I'm also going to use the same triple stitch at the end of the tail. BJ couched the end, which was nice too, but I liked how it looked in Wonderfil's pattern, so I'm going to try it that way. So here I have the tail all stitched out with couching and triple stitched lines. Next up I need to do the stitching on the throat, then the wings, and finally the flower stem that the bird is carrying in his beak. For the throat of the bird, Wonderfil calls for a lot of French knots, but I think using them tends to clump up the thread too much on the back of the fabric, at least stitching them by machine. On her hummingbird, BJ used stitch 657 on her Bernina 880, kind of a squiggly decorative stitch as an alternative, which looks similar but doesn't have as much knotting. On mine, I decided to try stitch 1341 to see if I can get the same sort of texture as the French knots. I'm also using a 35 Tech wool poly thread that Wonderfil calls Softloc, which is close to a 30 weight thread. It has just a bit of a softer look. I picked it out after BJ made her thread list, so we'll make sure to add a link to it here. So here's how this came out. I ended up keeping the texture going down a little further on the bird's body. Just for comparison, here's what BJ did using 657. I think it gives it some good texture too. Again, what we're really going for is to add something that has the impression of French knots. So if you find a stitch similar to either of these, that should work also. The next thing I need to do is something on the wings, like a bigger flower. On the pattern, they use lazy daisies here and a couple others over here and here. They have some other decorative star-type stitches and some French knots. I don't know if I'll use the French knots, but I think BJ did. I think these are stitch 711 in the larger versions, or it might be 1120, and then her French knot stitch in these other places. For the lazy daisies, BJ didn't have a larger flower, so she used a double version here. I'm going to try to make one with Bernina's stitch editor which might be interesting too, but this way you'll get to see both versions. I'll use that as a big one here and a couple of smaller ones. I'll probably just add a couple of decorative yellow stitches like BJ's in a couple of other places too to give it a little pop of color. So here's the Lazy Daisy I designed in the stitch editor, though it wasn't easy. There are a couple smaller versions here that mostly worked out. I used 7-11 here, and I think that balanced it nicely. At this point, the last thing I need to do is the twig that will run down to the tassel at the end to mimic a flower. So I marked out the stem with chalk, and I'm going to try and follow it with a variegated green spaghetti thread using stitch 138. The one trick is to make sure you start at the correct end so that the leaves are pointed up or down, whichever direction you want them. I'm going to switch to a straight stitch at the end so I don't risk it starting to stitch a leaf in the middle of the bird's beak. It looks pretty good, but I'm worried about the stem being lost in the wool a bit, so I'm going to couch an 8 weight on top of just the stem, not the leaves. I'm using a dark green variegated 8 weight pearl cotton that was one of the threads in BJ's list. This is pretty slow, making sure that I track the stem exactly and don't get off to one side or the other, but the stem is short so it isn't too bad. So if I watch this side of the line on the foot, I can see when it starts to get off and turn it.
The next thing is to add the tassel. Beth and I did this a bit differently, so we'll show you both here. Wonderfil also shows you how to make it on a short video that I will link to, and it is pretty simple. So I started by making and tied together a tassel like in Wonderfil's video. Then I placed it at the end of the flower stem with two sides of the tassel spread apart so I can stitch down the middle. I used stitch number 25, which is a bar tack, kind of a wide zigzag. I set it as wide as I can to 9 millimeters. Then I stitched the bar tack, letting it finish out the pattern to hold it in place. Then you hold down the sides of the tassel, overlapping in the middle. I tried to use the machine to sew the cap on the tassel, but found it was too thick for the machine no matter how high I set the presser foot pressure. I ended up sewing the cap of the tassel down to the block by hand, just like the Wonderfil video. You want to use a thimble because you're putting a lot of pressure on the needle to get it through all the layers. You want to wind it around enough times to get the effect of a nice satin stitch. You can tear away the stabilizer though to reduce the thickness, since we don't need it at this point. I finished up by trimming the tassel even.
So what I'm trying to do here is this twig in the bird's mouth, and then I need to make a tassel that becomes the flower part of the twig. I start by wrapping a red 8-weight pearl cotton around my forefingers 9 to 10 times. I did a whole lot of tests trying to sort out how much thread I could use so that it looks full enough but isn't so big that you can't stitch over it by machine. I finally settled on 9 times and it came out right in my tests. Now I have the tassel, so what I'm going to do is place this down so it's about even. Then I'm going to stitch a straight stitch over the tassel to hold it in place, probably back and forth 3 or 4 times. Then we'll fold these sides down and then sew a satin stitch over the top of this end at the base of the flower. Then we'll trim this end off to create a nice even flower look to it. I have the loops placed down and I want them to be pretty close to the end of the stem. I'm using a straight stitch with the default settings and I have the pressure foot at 35 and the 20D foot, but I don't think I can use the dual feed because it gets kind of thick. Then back up and forward again. Now I need to cut those threads. I don't need to secure them yet, but they do need to be cut pretty close, and also cut the bobbin thread so they don't get tangled. These are all well secured, so I'm going to fold them in half like this and pull them down like so. I want to get it nice and pulled down tight so that we can go over it fairly well. I switched to a zigzag starting with a length of 0.65 and the width is the default starting point at 3.6. This is a very slow process, pretty much stitch by stitch. I'm going to increase the width to 4.5 for one stitch, and then 6.0 for the next one. Now up to 7, but also make the length 0.7. Now up to 8.0 width and 0.75 for the length. And now up to 9 for the width and leave it at 0.75 for the length. I don't want too many of the satin stitches across, so let me take it out and look at how it came out. So the next thing is to bury this thread and trim off the ends. I like that it got a clump of bright green in the variegated thread right on the top of the flower. Now I just need to bury the threads. Then I tie them off and trim them. Finally, we need to give this flower a trim. Now I can separate some of these. This was 9 windings of thread, which is reasonably full but isn't too hard to stitch over. At this point, I think I'm done with the block. I like the nice long beak here. I like the pop of color between the yellow and the red, and I'm actually pretty happy with how the tail came out. I was worried about getting those evenly spaced. Now these are our 2 blocks. Obviously we had slightly different approaches, but they look very similar. She got some nice pops of color here too, and of course her tail feathers came out just fine. Everything else looks good, so I think we're all finished.
I hope you enjoyed this video and got some new ideas for your own versions of this block. I want to thank Beth for her help. It made a big difference. As always, if you have any questions for either of us, post them below and we'll make sure they get answered quickly. Just so you know, Beth will be giving a first demo of the next block or 2 while I'm taking care of some medical issues.
I'm glad to help keep this on track. It's been a lot of fun.
Then I'll be back to pick back up and finish it off. At the end of the quilt, you'll get to see both our versions of all of it. Every block is bringing new puzzles and new ideas, so stay tuned and we'll be back soon. Until then, have fun in your studios and keep stitching!